So between 1850 and 1890, the government passed several laws that affected the rights and legal status of Indigenous peoples. The goal essentially was to force Indigenous peoples to abandon their cultures, languages, and ways of life. Basically, assimilate them, try and make them as European as possible. So they came up with some treaties and rights. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 established the basic relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. It recognized that Indigenous peoples had occupied North America without interruption long before Europeans arrived, so they had a right to the land. This right is known as Aboriginal Title. And an Aboriginal title is the legal recognition that a particular territory belongs to a specific Indigenous group. So, according to this proclamation, Aboriginal title could only be ceded or given up by a treaty. So, here is an excerpt from the Royal Proclamation of 1763 made by King George III. At that time, the British referred to Indigenous peoples as Indians, which is considered, it's pretty offensive to say Indians now. So, what rights does this excerpt guarantee to Indigenous people? So this is what we call a primary source. So this is what historians will use to try and interpret and understand what their views were at that time. So this is written by King George III of the British Empire. And whereas it is just and reasonable and essential to our interest and the security of our colonies that the several nations of tribes of Indians with whom we are connected, who live under our protection, should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved to them or any of them as their hunting grounds. And we do further declare it to be our royal will and pleasure for the present as aforesaid to reserve under our sovereignty, protection, and dominion for the use of the said Indians all the lands and territories not included within the limits of our said 3 new governments, or within the limits of the territory granted to the Hudson's Bay Company, as also all the lands and territories lying to the westward of the sources of the rivers which fall into the sea from the west and northwest as aforesaid. So going back to that question, what rights does this excerpt guarantee to Indigenous people? Well, it basically guarantees that they will not be disturbed by settlers and that Indigenous homelands can only be transferred to settlers if they are ceded through a treaty or purchased. So that the proclamation still remains significant today, since it is enshrined or included in Canada's current constitution. So during the 1800s, Indigenous peoples entered into treaties with the British and Canadian governments in the hopes of protecting their land, resources, and ways of life. Indigenous peoples agreed to treaty terms like annual payments and hunting and fishing rights within their territories. Once the terms were settled, the government created a written version of agreements in English, that's important, which both sides signed. Many Indigenous groups disputed these written agreements, arguing that they did not reflect the spirit of the negotiation or the promises that were agreed upon. So you have to understand that when they were, so we're going to go down to this picture right here. When they were negotiating the treaties, they had an interpreter try and interpret what the groups were saying to each other. But all the treaties were written by the Europeans at that time. So essentially, they had the final last word of what this treaty would say. So the Indigenous people could be saying they want this right and this right, but it could have gotten lost in translation, or they could have intentionally not put it down. So that was part of the difficulty, and it's kind of unfair that the Europeans, when they're writing these treaties down, they're getting the last word in by writing it in English. So let's look at this painting entitled "The Blackfoot Treaty." So each treaty was numbered. Treaty number 7. In 1877, Crowfoot is speaking Crowfoot Speaking is by A. Bruce Stapleton, the artist. Crowfoot, Siksika chief Standing is negotiating with Colonel James McLeod and Lieutenant Governor David Laird. An interpreter is seated to the left of the Crowfoot. So analyze, how does this painting reveal the imbalance in power in the negotiations? And why is language so significant in treaty negotiations? So it definitely shows the imbalance. Like they have, this shows they can afford the shade. This guy's dressed in nice clothes. All these people are sitting down and kind of just like sitting at their feet. This painting definitely shows that these guys the Europeans have the upper hand, and that they're going to. This painting reveals that most treaty negotiations were completed through translators. And the seated poses of the two British representatives suggest an air of confidence. So the guy in the black there with the hat on, he just looks in control. The British established and controlled the treaty process and recorded written versions of the treaties in English. So just like what I was saying, as far as them getting the last word, and that's the important part there. That's the thing to take away. So language is significant in treaty negotiations for just that reason. Indigenous peoples relied on interpreters in good faith because the final agreements were written in a language that they did not speak. So they just hoped that what the Europeans were writing down was going to be fair and just. And you'll learn that it wasn't.